Eric, there's this problem I'm trying to solve at the center I run right now. And essentially what it boils down to is I'm considering creating a program that would serve both parents and the children that they are bringing to our center in unique ways, right? Where we would have something for the parents and something for the kids. We can get into the details of the program another day. But one of the things I've been trying to solve is how do I make this experience equally valuable and meaningful for the parent and for the kid at the same time, so that when they go home at the end of the day or the next day, they are going to encourage each other to go back to my center because it was a great experience for both of them. The risk being, if one or the other one is kind of like, I don't want to go back, that probably kills the family momentum to return to our center.
It happens fast.
It happens fast. My almost 5-year-old is already giving me those signals for lots of activities I propose. And so this really got me thinking about this flywheel concept. Now, there's this book called Good to Great by Jim Collins, and it's one of my all-time favorite business books. And he introduces this idea of a flywheel. So today, I would love to unpack this concept of a flywheel and see if we can create a foundation, a set of steps for our listeners to get their own social impact flywheel turning. How does that sound?
That sounds awesome. Let's do it.
Let's get into it.
I'm Eric Ressler.
I'm Jonathan Hicken.
And this is Designing Tomorrow.
One of my all-time favorite business books is one called Good to Great by James C. Collins. And he goes over a number of concepts that differentiate a business that is destined to succeed versus one that's destined to fail. Lots of wonderful concepts. I recommend everybody take a look at the book or at least at the summary because it was very transformational for me. One of my favorite concepts in this book, Good to Great, is this idea of a flywheel. Now, a flywheel in the real world is... You can almost imagine it as like one of those spinny toys at a playground. One of the ones where the kids all grab on tight and one of the parents spins that thing as fast as they can and the kids are holding on tight. If you've ever spun one of those things, you know that it takes a lot of effort initially to get that thing moving. But once it's moving, it just takes these regular, consistent, soft taps to keep that wheel spinning. And in the book Good to Great by James C. Collins, he talks about how businesses need to adopt a similar mindset of consistent effort, gradual momentum, and simple concepts over a long period of time build that flywheel. And I think the same things can exist in the social impact space. And so I want to figure out, how do we get there? How do we get these flywheels turning for the social impact sector? Before I propose some of the ideas I have, I'm curious if this is resonating with you and some of the conversations you're having with your clients.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea and the concept of a flywheel is very alluring, right? Because it's like, okay, if we can get this flywheel built and we do all this effort, at some point it starts to build its own momentum, and then we can, reduce the effort. It won't be such a big push each time. We're just doing these small pushes. And I think that can be true. And I think that when we look at, again, the kind of premise of our show here, what is the difference between social impact organizations that thrive and those that fail to get this traction and they can't make a meaningful impact? I think a lot of those organizations just never got to the point where that flywheel was spinning enough, right? They didn't ever get through the really hard parts of being an early stage organization to growing to a slightly later stage organization to reaching that threshold where there's a certain amount of just momentum. Another example is like if you look at some of the largest companies in the world, tech companies, whatever companies, when you get to a certain size and you have a certain amount of size as an organization, if you're big enough, you have more resiliency just by your size, right? You can take bigger bets and fail and like pick yourself back up more easily. You see this all the time in tech companies where they're pivoting and their pivots go wrong and they repivot again, but like just the sheer, just kind of like natural force of them keeps them afloat and keeps them moving at some point in a certain direction. So I think what I've seen building Cosmic and what I've seen helping other organizations who maybe are early stage, and I've watched them through our work and after our work grow beyond early stage, or worked with organizations that are, have a huge legacy. Some of our clients have been around for 100, 150 years even, some of our educational institutional clients. There is an ability to build this flywheel. Like, this is a real thing. This is not a mythological false promise. But I think that if you think about it, like, if we just build the flywheel, then everything will be easy. That is also not true.
That's oversimplifying, yeah.
Yes.
And I think that becomes an impossible thing to chase. But the fundamental concept of this flywheel, right, is like, once you get this thing spinning, it's just small efforts that keep it spinning. Daily, it's the daily grind, it's the daily activities that keep it spinning. But I'm like, how do you get to that place to begin with, right? And so I've been playing with this idea of like positive feedback loops, where how do we create these positive feedback loops in our social impact organizations, where one particular stakeholder interacting with us is creating a positive effect for another stakeholder group and vice versa. So it becomes the audience that is essentially itself keeping this flywheel turning. So the example that I'll bring, the most common example, is when we talk about donors seeing the impact of their investment, right? We want to provide that positive feedback loop for donors or members or whomever, so that they're getting that positive reinforcement that what they're doing means something and that they may want to do it again. That's the positive feedback loop that we talk about most often, at least in the nonprofit side of things. But I'm starting to believe that there are examples of these positive feedback loops between other stakeholder groups too. Is there any other examples that you can think of that this might apply to?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a branding and marketing standpoint, this is also true. There can be some positive feedback loops there. So it's almost like there's these mini flywheels that are powering the larger flywheel, right? And I think that this is true if we take the example of like really elevating your branding and marketing work. There's that initial inertia of a rebrand, or like rethinking about your brand strategy, or a big website overhaul, or rethinking of your social strategy. That is that like initial inertia, and it's hard, it's difficult work. It takes a lot of input and deep thought. And then when you're done, you're not done, but now you're just kind of nurturing that foundation that you've built, right? You're realizing the impact of that early investment that you've made. So I've definitely seen it on the branding and marketing side. But I think, just reflecting on what I've experienced running Cosmic, and also with observing, hundreds of different social impact organizations running their teams, is that there's like an internal team culture that has its own positive feedback loop too when done well, right? Where there's core values that are driving the work. There's clear delineation of responsibility. There's a shared clarity of purpose. And when these kind of more cultural, strategic elements are built properly, that can become a positive feedback loop of getting the right people in the right seats, doing good work, seeing impact, being proud of that, being energized and not burnt out. Gives your organization resiliency to be able to, afford to pay people what they're worth, give them a living wage, and not, fall into the scarcity trap of the nonprofit sector and underpaying people, and maybe even, frankly, exploiting them intentionally or unintentionally. So there's all kinds of different examples I think we could come up with of these mini flywheels or small positive feedback loops that are all pushing the overall inertia and momentum of the organization in a positive direction.
The organization I run, we have a physical space that the public comes through, and I wonder to what degree showing those people who are coming into our space the impact of even the admission ticket that they bought. What impact is that $12 having on the community where this center exists? Do they care? And if we started demonstrating that more, would that be a contributor to helping our flywheel start to turn, where it's bridging this commerciality and impact divide, where it's like anytime there's a transaction, a financial transaction, we are demonstrating the impact of that transaction in the moment. But also I think about the opposite side of that, where the people that are experiencing the impact most intimately, are we also showing them the contributions of the community that made the impact for them possible? And these are just a couple of examples of ways that I'm playing with, bridging the commerciality and impact divide to create this positive feedback loop that might get our flywheel spinning. Is this just pie in the sky kind of thinking, or is there something real here?
I mean, I think there's definitely something real, especially when you're trying to connect donations or price of admission to impact. It's interesting to me because like this is one of the most like fundamental best practices of social impact organizations, right? Is like doing a good job connecting donations or volunteer work or price of admissions to the impact. But I just see so many examples where this is not done well. And I don't want to put the blame necessarily on social impact leaders or organizations because it's not necessarily easy to do well. But I do think that there's often a gap between, I think like we sometimes just kind of expect our audience and our community to connect the dots on their own. And no one's doing that basically, right? No one is sitting there thinking about how their price of admission is going to help cover a living wage for an employee at a Marine Discovery Center. They're there for their own kind of personal reasons. And it's not to say that people don't care about supporting organizations. And I do think sometimes people will make those kind of more subconscious choices where they're like, you know what, this feels kind of expensive, but I know it's going to a good cause, right? Or I feel compelled to donate because I believe in the work that they're doing and I don't need any numbers to back that up. So that is also true. But I do think that some of the best examples of social impact marketing and social impact communications, they do a really good job of telling interesting, compelling stories about how your individual personal contributions have led to meaningful, measurable impact.
We talk about that a lot in this sector, but we don't talk a lot about the opposite direction, right? So we talk a lot about the transactors understanding the impact of their transaction, but do we show the impactees where that impact came from, right? And does that matter to getting the flywheel spinning?
Man, it's a delicate balance because how do you do that in a way that doesn't get into like a savior syndrome, right? Where it's like, we're coming in to save you because you are underserved or you can't do this on your own, right? And I mean, obviously this is very context dependent. Are you serving an underserved population? Even that terminology feels kind of icky to use, right? This is a conversation that is just being broadly had in the space, right? So I don't know. I mean, I think that if that were done in a way that connected people, right? So let's put a hypothetical together here. So if you connected donors to the people that their donation ultimately went and helped as a way to connect the community, not to make donors feel good about themselves or not to make the people who have been helped feel like they owe something to the donors. If it's done in that kind of like respectful, ethical way, then I think that could be a really powerful way to build community around different stakeholders within your organization. But I think it's just a tricky one.
It's a tricky one. And I do think in its best version, it really could get that flywheel spinning. You know, you brought up some shortcomings in our space of demonstrating our impact to contributors like donors or foundations and telling those stories in an effective way. What I have seen is that people in our sector understand that this is something we have to do. It's not a surprise that we need to demonstrate our impact to the people who support us. I think one of the mistakes that we make most commonly, and I think one that if we corrected would get that positive feedback loop going, get that flywheel turning, is to make this feedback more immediate, right? I think it's particularly in the world we live that we need to show these impacts almost instantly in the moment the transaction's made. And that's easier said than done. I think traditionally our sectors, especially in the nonprofit world, we are accustomed to writing these annual reports and we, at best a quarterly director's update, right? And yeah, those are great. And I'm not discouraging people from doing those. There's a lot of value in going through that process. For some of your donors, they may wait an entire year before they're hearing the impact of their contribution in any meaningful way. So one of the things I think is important to get that flywheel turning is the immediacy of the feedback, especially towards the transactor.
Yeah, I love this line of discussion because I think it is so important. And I've personally experienced this a lot. I donate to a bunch of different organizations and organizations who are, by many measures, like quite successful. And I've been very surprised at the discrepancy between some organizations and others around their impact storytelling. I've made donations to, and I'm not going to name any names because I don't like, publicly shaming anyone. But I've donated to some well-known organizations and been very surprised just by how lackluster the storytelling and the connection to impact is. And, I donate and then, 2 weeks later, the very next piece of communication I get from them is like, in worst case, another appeal for further donation. And with no impact storytelling in between. On the flip side, some of the best organizations are not afraid to tell stories about immediately, like, hey, thank you for your contribution. Because of people like you and your support, we're able to help people like this achieve these outcomes. And I get that message like immediately. And that's kind of like that reinforcement of like, this was a good choice. Like, I'm supporting an organization that is making a meaningful difference. They're going to make sure I know that. And that's not the only return on your investment as a donor or a supporter, but it's an important one, right? You want to know, like, hey, this didn't just go into some random bucket. Even if it did go into, let's say, like an overhead bucket, like, I'm not suggesting that we need to go to the like 100% program work funded line of messaging, because I think that is long-term a bad strategy for the sector too. But I want to know that, like, when I dedicate time, energy, or money into supporting an organization, that it's doing something. Like, this is so basic, right? But so many organizations don't get this part right. Or if they are getting it kind of right, there's always room for improvement. Now, on the social enterprise side, if we kind of go more to like a customer, there's a couple different ways that you get a return on your investment in like a positive feedback loop, right? So one of the ways is, let's just take an example of supporting like an ethical shoe company. Let's take Allbirds, for example. They're actually one of my favorite social enterprises. Why do I support Allbirds? I support Allbirds because they make shoes that are comfortable. They make shoes that last a long time. They make shoes that are built out of sustainable materials, and they are like authentically inventing better ways to make sustainable shoes that do not add to the landfill and do not have a negative impact on our climate. And Allbirds does a really good job of telling me how they are moving that mission forward all the time. And yes, they send a lot of sales emails and marketing emails too, because they're a social enterprise. They need to sell product because that's what powers their mission. But they do that in such a good, immediate way. And they reinforce that belief that, like, hey, I feel good about buying these shoes, not just because they're comfortable and because they work well. That's kind of a prerequisite, right? If they were sustainable, but they fell apart right away, are they even sustainable at that point, right? But because I know that through their storytelling, they are constantly reinforcing that, like, I've made a good choice by supporting this brand. So I just think there's so many of these little like micro feedback cycles that if you start to think about how to create these, they kind of add up to be greater than the sum of their parts.
And I'd bet that as soon as you buy a pair of shoes from Allbirds, you have an email validating the impact you've made in your inbox moments later.
Yes.
And so there's that immediacy power. You talk a lot about, even in season 1, you talked about competing in the attention economy for the social impact sector. And I think speed and I think immediacy is one of those ways that we're probably falling behind, is that instant feedback towards an action that someone's taken, whether that's a financial transaction or otherwise.
Yeah, and I mean, absolutely, and it doesn't need to be super sophisticated, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many organizations don't even send a thank you email after receiving a donation, or even just like a confirmation email. Like, did that even work? I don't know. So that's like, bottom, like the lowest bar to hit. And you can get more sophisticated than that, but like even just a simple, like, because of people like you, we are able to achieve results like this. That should be very doable. If you can't do that, you have much bigger problems, because maybe are you even making an impact? Now, can you get more sophisticated than that and start to do some calculations around like every dollar you donate leads to this exact kind of impact? That's great, right? Like, people love that. That really super tangible, immediate understanding is great. There's a little bit more work to get that going. It takes a little bit more historical data to be able to tell those kinds of stories and include that kind of statistical data accurately and authentically. But I think these are the kind of ideas that you should be exploring. And I think the idea of immediacy is one that we under index on in the social impact space. And you're probably, leading to donor churn and customer churn, because if you have to wait a year for the annual report to come out to know that your purchase or your donation made a meaningful impact, that is probably too long.
I'm glad you brought up donor churn or participant churn, because that leads me into the third idea I want to bring forward as it relates to getting your flywheel spinning and keeping it spinning, which is this idea of eliminating single-threaded value. So what do I mean by that? Someone that's interacting with your organization may be receiving multiple points of value from you at any given point, at any given time. Or I would also extend that to say that people in their immediate circles might be receiving value as well. A single-threaded value situation is one where there's a single individual that gets one kind of value from your organization. Nobody else in their immediate circle is getting value. It's just them, and there's one way they're getting value. That is a recipe for churn. If there's one thread that if it's snipped, you're going to lose that individual, and they're no longer going to be contributing to the momentum of your flywheel. So I like to think about this idea of multi-threaded value situations where, and to give you go back to the example I led with, where a parent and a kid are both coming in and they're both getting value at the same time in the same place. That's a dual-threaded value scenario we've set up, where if one gets snipped, it makes it harder to retain the participation of that family, but it's not impossible to get them back in some way. So I encourage people to think about, like, are the people interacting with my organization connected by a single thread, or are there multiple threads here? I'd love to hear what's going through your head when I talk about this concept.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've never really, I haven't used that terminology or heard that terminology before, but I think to me, this is about deepening relationships with your community of supporters, right? So people will come in with initial touch points with your brand and start to build a relationship for one reason. But if you do a good job as a social impact organization, that relationship will deepen and nurture over time. And they may have come in initially because they support your mission and, they feel compelled and generous and they want to, do a one-time donation. But then they start to see, wow, like this organization is really making an impact, making a difference. They're credible. I feel good about supporting them. You know what? I'm going to become a monthly donor, or I'm going to join the giving circle and come in at a bigger amount if I can afford to. And that's maybe what begins for them. But as they deepen the relationship with your organization, now they have a sense of like identity associated with your brand and a sense of community associated with your brand in your organization. And that is not just another thread, but I think a stronger thread than just a thread of just pure altruism and generosity. And these can work together again. So I like the idea of thinking about how can we create multiple threads of connection and support and relationship with our different stakeholders for our brand. Because as the world changes and as situations change, if you're relying just on one and it gets snapped or snipped to your point, then you start to churn and lose people.
That's right. And, we talk about deepening relationships in the sector a lot. And I think what we're doing here is we're describing what that really means.
Yeah.
What does it mean to build a deeper relationship? Offering different kinds of value, offering value to other people in their immediate world and their families or their friends or their colleagues or whomever, and making sure that every individual that we engage with, we have a plan or we have a journey set out to make sure that they're finding multiple points of value in interacting with us. That could be transactional, it could be emotional, it can be a number of different things. But as soon as we have multiple threads to an individual, the more likely that they are to, stick with us for the long haul. So thanks for helping me think through this today, right? This idea of getting a flywheel spinning and how do you actually get a flywheel spinning? Just to recap, and then I'd love to hear any takeaways you've had. The flywheel concept from the book Good to Great is really about consistent effort and gradual momentum over a long period of time applied to a very simple concept, which I think a lot of social impact organizations can do and maybe already doing. And some of the thoughts we've added today about how to do that in the social impact space is to bridge the commerciality and impact divide with these positive feedback loops, to make the feedback immediate or as immediate as possible, and to eliminate these single-threaded relationships. What are your takeaways from today?
I think it's interesting to me that we ended with this kind of exploration of value creation. And this is one that We spent a little bit of time talking about this in season 1. It's something that we think about a lot when working with our clients. I think it's something that we could all spend a little bit more time thinking about. Like, how do we create value as organizations? And I think a lot of times that goes, intuitively to the impact, right? The impact that we're creating. And like, of course, that should be front and center in your thinking. But there's a lot of other ways you can create value as an organization that might not feel as intuitive. And I definitely recommend that any listeners to the show, any social impact leaders, think about like, what are the ways that we actually can create value and how are we uniquely positioned to create value for our different stakeholders? And that can really help guide and drive some of your decision making and where you invest your time and energy.
Cheers to that. Well, thanks for playing with me in this playground today, Eric. That was a fun one. I think that'll do it for today.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to hit like and subscribe, or even leave us a comment. It really helps. Thank you. And thank you for all that you do for your cause and for being part of the movement to move humanity and the planet forward.